Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Aiza Umar. Now, peace talks are currently underway in Sweden between Yemen's warring sides. Terms are being ironed out on a large-scale prisoner swap between Houthi rebels and the Yemeni government. Some 16,000 detainees are expected to be released next year. Now, can these peace talks be considered as successful, and are they on the right roadmap leading up to the prisoner swap? And what can we expect by January 20th? Let's talk to our panel of experts. We have a journalist based out of Istanbul, Mr. Michael Arnold. Thank you for joining us here on Newswire. And also, I'd like to welcome Mr. Adil Dashela, who is a researcher of a Yemeni think tank, also based in Istanbul. Let me start with you, Mr. Arnold. These talks being that are underway currently in Sweden between the Houthis and the Yemeni government, and they're expected to conclude in a few days. How do you feel they are going so far, and are they on the right track?
Well, I think they are going according to expectations. Most players involved, I don't think, saw great expectations from these peace talks. However, the agreement, or ostensible agreement on a prisoner swap, I think should be considered as a success. Terms are on the right track. There are major obstacles that remain, and those remain to be sorted out.
Mr. Adil, what, in your opinion, are the major obstacles that lie ahead?
So much. At the beginning, I would like, we don't have any choice except to be optimistic. Therefore, I think that the two parties now are discussing the details of confidence-building measures. And we are waiting for Houthis. If the Houthis release for more than 15,000, not only 8,500, more than 15,000 are in the prisons of Al-Houthi. If Houthis release all these prisoners, maybe in the future we can reach to a political process and even a reconciliation and stability, peace and security. Now we don't know. The next few days we will see how Houthis will accept to release all these prisoners, because most of them are innocent people, politicians, students, journalists, and Houthis arrested them, as random arrests. They didn't commit any political crimes. Now in Sweden, they have discussed only four issues. First one, how to release these prisoners from all sides. Second one, the economic situations, humanitarian crisis, and economy. And we don't know. We need to see the mechanism of implementation. If the Houthis accept, but I think that all Yemenis don't think that Houthi will achieve his obligations.
Adil, I'll ask you now, the core issue involving the Yemeni government and the Houthi rebels and other insurgents in the region, what really is, if you could pinpoint for us, the core issue right now in this conflict?
The core issue is how to end the military coup by the Houthis. Now we have international resolution number 2216, and we have the outcome of the Yemeni National Dialogue Conference, and we have the Deputy Initiative. If the Houthis end their military coup, we can reach to a peace and stability. I think that Houthis will not accept to hand over their weapons and to withdraw their militias from the central capital of Yemen, Sana'a, and the areas or governorates which are under their control. Now, Houthis, as a radical movement and as a sectarian militias, they believe in violence more than peace. And therefore, I think that Houthis will not accept the international resolution 2216 and the outcomes of the National Dialogue Conference. And therefore, I think that how can we achieve peace? I think that, unfortunately, violence will continue. Now Houthis is continuing and fighting Yemenis in Taiz, Hodeidah, and Marib, and Al-Jof, and Sana'a. Houthis till now didn't stop fighting. And how can we achieve peace? Therefore, I think that Houthis will not stop their war and their military coup if they don't defeated by the Yemeni government.
Mr. Adil, Houthis started off having a lot of support of the popular vote was behind them. The popular sentiment of the Yemeni people was behind them. And this is as recent as 4 or 5 years ago. How has the situation on the ground changed now? How much of that support do they still have?
Excuse me. No, Houthi is not supported by the Yemeni people. 99% of the Yemeni people are against Houthis. Houthis now, they attack people at their houses and they spread random arrests and they torture people in their secret prisons. And therefore, Yemenis who are under the controls of al-Houthi cannot say no to Houthis. Now they are waiting for the Yemeni government, and I think that Houthis on the ground are not strong, but they have missiles, they have weapons, and they have a lot of militias, and now people are, Yemenis are in large prisons in the areas which are under the control of al-Houthi. Houthis are 10% of the Yemeni population. And how can the minority rule the majority? 90% of the Yemenis rejected Houthi. How can they accept Houthi as a sectarian military? Unfortunately, international community sides with Houthis, with this minority or a group of militias. Therefore, I think that in the future, Yemenis will decide their future if the international community gives them opportunity to end the military coup in Sana'a.
Okay. And Mr. Mark, do you feel like in these peace talks as they progress, there's still a few days left, will the UN be able to broker an effective argument between both the parties, to try and get them on the same table, on the same page in how this power sharing is going to take place, or at least what steps are going to take place for the Yemeni government to come on the same page with the Houthi?
Before I answer your question, I just want to go back to something Mr. Adil had mentioned in terms of the I guess sectarian dimension of the conflict. I think if we're speaking today without taking into even context, even recent history, of course we can look at the facts on the ground today and say, okay, this appears to be a sectarian-based conflict. However, I think it's a bit of an overstretch to shape the roots of the conflict in those terms. As you mentioned yourself, the Houthis initially had at least a degree of cross-sectarian popular support amongst people, particularly in the northern region of Yemen, which included, of course, Zaidi Shia communities as well as Sunni communities as well. As time has progressed, there definitely has been negative sentiments toward the Houthis from within the Zaidi community itself. However, to frame the entire conflict in sectarian terms as its roots, I think is very problematic, and it also it negates some of the complexities of the conflict itself. To your point regarding the UN being able to bring these two sides together, unfortunately, I think that actually depends more on the both regional and international players. Now, these peace talks, of course, are a good first step. They represent confidence-building measures. The prisoner swap, again, should not be underestimated as it does represent a significant moment. However, the fact that the Saudi-led coalition, of course, the American backers, as well as key international players such as France, Iran, etc., are not invited to this conference, are not at the table, indicates that I think the objectives, or at least the realistic objectives, were limited from the very beginning.
Not having key international stakeholders invited to these talks, how does that affect the objective of establishing or at least starting a peace process in the region?
I think that international community now tries to achieve peace in Yemen, but unfortunately 3 years ago, and international community didn't impose sanctions against Iranian regime because Iranian regime is supporting Houthis. And how can we achieve peace if there is no sanctions against Iranian regime and against Houthis? Because Houthis is a part of a large group in the region. Now, Houthi is a part of Hezbollah and another group in Syria and in Iran and in Bahrain. Houthis will not accept peace. Therefore, I think that international community, unfortunately, is supporting sectarian conflict in Yemen, and the Yemeni people are the innocents of this proxy war.
But Mr. Adil, what I'm trying to ask you is that how is it affecting these peace talks, that fact that the Saudi-led coalition is not even invited to the table? They're not part of this conversation. Iran has not been invited. UK, France, all of these stakeholders have not had a say. What could be the reasoning behind that, and how does it affect the peace talks?
Houthis now Saudis are not a part of this conflict. The real conflict is between the Yemeni government and the militias of al-Houthi. Saudis are supporting the Yemeni government, and they encourage the political process as Houthis accept that. But I think that the scenario is very difficult and situation is very difficult, and therefore, as I told you, that now Yemenis unfortunately pay the price of this conflict.
So, Mr. Michael, let me pull you in here. Do you agree with this statement that the Saudis are not part of this conflict? This is essentially between just the military power of the Houthis and the Yemeni government?
Mr. Adil, I think that is at best a very oversimplistic analysis, and at worst, this is the type of rhetoric that has perpetuated a certain vision of the conflict of being one localized to only the government and the Houthi militias, and not taking into consideration all of the sort of political complexities in Yemen, including the al-Islah opposition movement, which of course its youth wing at the very least was leading the 2011 protests. So to say that the Saudi-led coalition is not involved in the conflict, I think is clearly not accurate. The Yemeni government has very little room to operate in and of itself. Its president is currently in Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi-led coalition, of course, with American logistical support, has been leading a very brutal aerial bombardment campaign, which has significantly contributed to Yemen being what the UN calls the worst humanitarian disaster in the world right now. This is not to say that the Houthis have no blame in this. If we're looking at it from an objective analysis, at least in terms of the current conflict that begins in 2015, we can probably say that the Houthis bear primary responsibility for the beginning of the conflict. However, it's very clear that the Saudi-led coalition, the bombardment campaign, the blockades that they've imposed, air, sea, and land blockades, have exacerbated the conflict. And it's very clear as well that very little steps were taken to avoid civilian casualties. And it seems, and this is coming from human rights organizations, from within the American government itself, that the Saudi-led coalition has deliberately enacted a policy of collective punishment, particularly on towns and villages in the north of Yemen, which have been declared as, the whole towns have been declared, and cities have been declared as war zones, meaning that all targets are legitimate within those cities. So I think to expect and to frame it in the context of it being merely a conflict between some almost non-existent Yemeni government in some ways and the Houthi militia is clearly not the case.
So what do you think, Mr. Adil, if you have said that this is just a fight between the Houthi rebels and the Yemeni government, what is the Yemeni government then willing to agree to? What terms are they willing to agree to with the Houthis?
Now, as I told you that, the clash is between the legitimate Yemeni government and the Houthis who led a military coup. And therefore, I think that the Yemeni government doesn't have any choice except to continue fighting Houthis till they withdraw their militias from the capital of Sana'a and to end their military coup. And therefore, Saudis or United or Emiratis or Arab coalition in general, they emphasized that we support the Yemeni government and we side with the Yemeni people, and the Yemeni people have to decide their future. And I think that today or tomorrow, the military coup will be ended because Houthis are rejected by all key Yemenis. Unfortunately, now more than 10,000 or 15,000 of Yemeni people have been killed by the militias of al-Houthi. More than
But they should have...
of people.
But we're still trying to get a sense of what kind of terms and conditions that have been put forth and are being discussed right now in the peace talks, especially since Houthis have come out and said, I mean, this is something you have not acknowledged, is that the Saudi-led coalition is part of this or has any role to play. I mean, the Houthis have come out and said themselves that they are ready to hand over the port of Hodeidah to the UN if the Saudi-led coalition stops airstrikes.
Houthis will not hand over the Hodeidah port to the UN because, Houthis now they are trying to get a chance, and they are trying to show that they are innocent people in Hodeidah. Houthis don't have any choice except to leave Hodeidah. And how can we accept? Because this is a legitimized Yemeni government. And the international community has to respect the sovereignty of the Yemeni state, has to respect this government. If the United Nations now interfere in Hodeidah and to rule al-Hodeidah port or the city of al-Hodeidah, okay, what about the Yemeni government? Why did the international community has issued a resolution 2216 to support the Yemeni government? Now they are, for example, now there is a war between two sides. No, there is a war between a military coup and the Yemeni government. And therefore, I think that Houthis has to deliver or to hand over Hodeidah to the Yemeni government, not to the United Nations. And I think that the Yemeni government will not accept to hand over the Yemeni port of al-Hodeidah to UN only if there is a mechanism to and the port of al-Hodeidah and the port should be under the control of the Yemeni government. The United Nations can support the Yemeni government, but al-Houthis want to, for example, to hand over al-Hodeidah to the UN, and they want their militias to stay in Hodeidah. Okay, this is unacceptable.
So you're basically saying that the only solution out of this situation is that the Houthi rebels need to be removed from power. They are a nuisance that need to go. There is no question about coming to terms or negotiating any deal?
Negotiation in the future, I think that Houthis will not accept peace, will not accept negotiation. How the Houthis will accept to hand over their weapons to the Yemeni government? How can Houthis hand over the cities which are under their control? How these violent militias accept peace? I think that Yemeni government and international community or international players such as US and UK and other countries don't have any choice except to support the Yemeni government to remove the Houthis from power by force. Houthis will not accept peace.
Okay, let me ask you, Mr. Michael, about other key demands from either side that will be discussed in these talks. And I'm referring to lifting of the siege on Taiz and other disputes over the Sana'a airport.
Yeah, I mean, there again are, of course, a number of very specific issues which they're discussing in these peace talks, which they may or may not make some progress on. The siege of Taiz and the issue of the Sana'a airport, I think, are relatively minor issues if we're looking at specific issues compared to Hodeidah, for example. I think Hodeidah in this sense is really the key, and you and your other guests have been speaking at length about this particular issue. In theory, both sides have accepted that there should be a UN role in the administration of Hodeidah, but as we can hear from your other guests, I think it seems that the position of the Yemeni government, as well, of course, as the coalition backing it, is that the port should be handed over to the Yemeni Interior Ministry, while the Houthis say that it should be handed over to the UN to be administered neutrally, under the condition, of course, that the Saudis not only stop the airstrikes, but lift the blockade as well. To some of the other points that your other guest was discussing in terms of moving forward and resolving the conflict, look, again, I think it's very simple and easy to frame this in as if these issues appeared out of nowhere in 2015. Let's not forget that this is not the first civil war that has occurred in Yemen, and while some of the specific issues, of course, are different from conflict to conflict, there remains core issues, core institutional issues at place here that, regardless of prisoner swaps, regardless of deals on who controls what city, although these may help move towards the end of the conflict, if these core institutional issues are not resolved in Yemen, the conflict will not move forward. At the same time, having said that, it would appear from history, at least, that there are certain regional powers that perhaps may not be interested in resolving some of these core issues. So I think this is the key that we really have to look at. We have to look at a little bit of a longer picture, at least, and understand that regardless of some of the criminality of the Houthis, regardless of the potential, the alleged war crimes committed by the Saudi-led coalition, there are core institutional and core societal issues at play here. And again, revolving around what I discussed earlier, decentralization of power, institutional representation, distribution of wealth. These are not going to go away in these types of peace talks that we're discussing now. And these remain core issues that have carried over from the 1990s, if not before that.
I want to ask you about the humanitarian aid situation. It has been declared one of the worst humanitarian crises seen in the world in recent history. Now, a lot of the road routes to the main conflict areas have been either bombed or have been blocked. And humanitarian aid, though coming in billions of dollars, been pledged and received, is not getting through. Can you talk a little about the main hurdles that the UN agencies and other agencies trying to provide aid to those needed most are facing?
Excuse me. Unfortunately, United Nations organizations have received $1 billion from Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. Unfortunately, now only 40% of this billion has reached to the Yemeni people. Now we have more than 2 million of the Yemeni people cannot get their food. And at the same time, millions of the Yemeni children are in hunger. And I think that the United Nations organizations cannot solve the Yemeni humanitarian crisis if we don't remove the militias of al-Houthi from power. We have to end the military coup, and then we can solve the humanitarian crisis. Without defeating the military coup of al-Houthi, the humanitarian crisis, unfortunately, will continue, and maybe Yemenis we will see another scenario in Yemen like Somalia in the last century.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. and Michael. Also, we'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire. Let me introduce my two new guests here. Mr. Ubaidah Heto, he's a journalist who will be joining us, and a political analyst. And also, I would like to welcome Mr. Talha Abdul Razak from the UK, researcher at the University of Exeter Strategy and Security Institute, also a political analyst. Let me start with you, Mr. Ubaidah. You've been following this conflict in Yemen, and also as the talks are progressing in Sweden between the Houthis and the Yemeni government. They're expected to conclude in a few days, but as we progress towards their conclusion, how do you feel they are going? Are they on the right track? And the prisoner swap that has been agreed on, is that a significant achievement in your perception?
A milestone in the peace talks for Yemen, because this is the first time that the two sides have had face-to-face talks in 2 years. And they expected to achieve minimal things, but it seems like they've made some reasonable amount of progress. They've agreed to arrange for the exchange of thousands of political prisoners by January 20th of next year. So it'll take some time for all of those details and the logistics to be sorted out. They were hoping also to make some progress on two more issues, including, or basically the two other core issues of their talks were an agreement on the central bank as well as conflicting Hodeidah and the port of Hodeidah, which is the main port of entry for goods, including humanitarian aid into Yemen. So it seems like the efforts of the UN envoy, the special UN envoy to Yemen, to get the parties to Sweden, to this small village in Sweden called Rimbo, to talk for these several days, has been a success. It's going to deliver some things in the coming months. Nothing has been delivered yet. The only thing that has been delivered is commitments to make some kind of deliverable agreement, or to reach a deliverable agreement and then to execute that. But we haven't actually seen anybody deliver anything yet. It's all commitments at this point. It's more than they have done in the past 2 years, which is a good thing. But the exchange of prisoners is still something that is exclusive to the two warring sides. It's not actually going to provide relief necessarily to people on the ground. And I think this is what most people, especially the international community, as far as what we can hear the UN Special Envoy say, is that he's concerned about the safety of people and people's ability to get food and medical supplies. And so this is the main, I think, crux of what is going on here. But we don't know yet if any of this will actually have any effect on the ground.
What is your take on it, Mr. Talha? Do you feel that just the talks taking place successfully, considered they failed in the past few attempts that have taken place in the past years, how is this going to affect the conflict in terms of bringing peace into the region?
Well, I think largely, actually, I agree with Mr. Ubaidah Hito. I have to say that, you know, it is a milestone in and of itself, the fact that they're having these talks in the first place. But let's not forget that the last time there were talks, those talks failed. The national dialogue talks failed because the Houthis actually abandoned those talks. They then took up arms and marched against the capital, and, you know, everyone's seen kind of what's happened in Sana'a ever since. It's also important to view these talks within the lens of what's going on in the wider geostrategic context. So if we look, Saudi Arabia is under immense international pressure to halt its bombardment of Yemen. And that's largely due to the immense human toll that military activities have had on normal Yemeni civilians. On top of that, we have the humanitarian crisis that's largely predicated upon the fact that there's a siege on the port of Hodeidah. Mm-hmm. And so 90% of the supplies go through that port. That's going to be a key sticking point in the negotiation. So if it comes under UN administration, it could significantly relieve the food shortages, the medicine shortages, and other critical infrastructure problems in Yemen that are really affecting the citizenship right now. And we also have to bear in mind the Iranian role in these negotiations. Obviously, the Houthis are directly backed by Iran, and Iran and Saudi Arabia have had an ongoing slugging match for the past several years, especially under the reign of King Salman bin Abdulaziz and the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So I don't think we can divorce the talks from the bigger power players who have been backing both sides. And it's important to keep that into consideration while we're looking at the future of these talks and where they could possibly go.
So, Mr. Ubaidah, not having Saudi Arabia on the peace negotiating table, not having Iran part of this conversation, and also US and UK and France who have been providing logistical and other support to the Saudi-led coalition in their air bombing and their involvement in this conflict. How does this even affect the lack of their presence? How, in your view, does this affect these talks?
In fact, I believe that their lack of presence is a direct result of their involvement in the conflict. You see, the talks that took place recently in Sweden have been in the works for some time. A couple months ago, I believe it was in September or early October, late September or early October, they tried to get talks going, but the Houthi delegation didn't make it to the talks in Geneva. And there was talk about why they didn't make it. And the Houthis said that they were blockaded, they weren't allowed to leave, and the airspace wasn't given to them. And there was some discussion about that. But now that they've actually made it to talks, the whole reason they were actually sit down on the table was because of the fallout of the Khashoggi killing and Saudi Arabia's role in providing Saudi Arabia's role in providing basically the heavy weapons used to attack Yemen in different ways, and at the same time, the Western powers, including the U.S. and the U.K., who were providing the weapons, were also pressured because of the actions of Mohammed bin Salman, increased criticism about his policies and his aggressive stance on Yemen, and calls on him to stop, as Talha said, to create a ceasefire in Yemen to help people, escape, or to help people get some relief from the ongoing fighting. And so all of this came to fruition following the disappearance and what we now know of the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. This all kind of instigated an international outcry against the situation in Yemen, built on the criticism that Mohammed bin Salman and people who were supporting Mohammed bin Salman and the efforts in Yemen, the Saudi efforts in Yemen, to put them to an end. And I would like to also add here that it seems like the Saudis also, after all of this pressure, the Saudi government is willing to play ball, if you will allow me, because they want to relieve that political pressure, that international pressure on them that resulted from this Khashoggi crisis. So they showed willingness, to go or allow the people who they were supporting to go to the negotiating table and to compromise on some key issues. Because you have to keep in mind that these thousands of prisoners, I'm sure, include people who might perhaps be Saudi citizens, contractors that the Saudis and the Emiratis had hired to come to Yemen and fight on behalf of the Saudis and the Emiratis. So there's a lot of intricate details related to this, and that's all adding up to the pressure on Saudi Arabia to be flexible, or to be forced to be flexible and compromise at the negotiating table. And this, as I said, is all a result of the international pressure that mounted on Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi government and the kind of Western establishment that was behind them following the Khashoggi killing. So I don't think this is something that is actually their lack of presence at the negotiating table in Sweden is not actually a sign of their lack of involvement. It's actually a sign of their willingness to let the parties that are that they back to go to the negotiating table.
Okay, so Mr. Talha, let me ask you this. Do you agree with what Mr. Ubaidah has just said, in that the international community has managed to pressurize Saudi Arabia enough to make them want to back out now, considering, or at least lay down arms, especially considering what a war reporting agency, a war monitor, has just come out with numbers of that the death toll just this month is hitting 3,000 people after these Saudi UAE coalition intensified the air raids there in Yemen?
Absolutely. I think Ubaid is on the money 100% here. Look, you have to understand, with Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen, those were for legitimate concerns. What Iran has been doing in the region since arguably 2003, since the invasion of Iraq, has been to piecemeal take Arab countries under its sway. So now if you look at Iraq, it's very much under the control of Iran. If you look at Syria, the same thing. There's a bit of a tussle with the Russians, but Iran has a very strong presence there. Yemen also. Iraq is on the northern border of Saudi Arabia. There was a crisis in Bahrain at the outset of the Arab Spring, which eventually had a Saudi Arabian intervention with the Peninsula Shield Force, which was deployed into Bahrain to quell the rebellion by predominantly Bahraini Shia, who many linked to the Ayatollahs in Iran. And indeed, the protests there at the time had pictures of Khomeini and Khamenei. So these really concerned the Saudi Arabians. They were thinking, we're being surrounded here. So their intervention in Yemen was for legitimate reasons. The issue that occurred afterwards is the execution of the strategy to prevent another Iranian foothold, this time on their southern border. So as we saw, we've got catastrophic civilian deaths. Like you said, with the number of deaths reaching thousands this month alone.
3,000.
It's a crazy
It's
figure,
one of the worst humanitarian crises. Yet what really stands out in these peace talks right now is that while this is taking place, there's an international community acknowledges that the key players are not just the Houthis versus the Yemeni government. I mean, there are experts saying clear out that this is a conversation that we need to have with not just Saudi Arabia and the other 8 Arab states who are part of this coalition, but also with Iran. I mean, this is a proxy war that is taking a toll on over 400,000 children who are facing acute malnutrition. So how are these peace talks bringing us closer to resolving this issue, which seems to be, in larger opinion, the core issue in the region?
Well, this is going back to what I was trying to say, is that the strategic calculus for the Saudis has changed. So initially, it was about protecting their southern border and ensuring that another Iranian proxy would not be set up there. Now, though, they're thinking, well, hang on, in addition to the catastrophic humanitarian costs, and now the whole Khashoggi crisis, the Saudi Arabian international image has taken such a drubbing that one could say that they've already suffered a catastrophic strategic defeat against the Iranians. In the Yemeni sphere, the risks of them staying versus the risks of them leaving has now changed. It's now almost preferable to Riyadh to leave Yemen, to kind of throw in the towel, admit defeat, and to kind of salvage what international reputation they have, than it is to stay and keep bombing mountainous areas without any, tangible results on the ground. So if they cannot force a military outcome like they originally thought that they could, they have to negotiate, and that's why they will be pressuring their allies in the Yemeni government to come to an agreement.
But Mr. Ubaidah, let me ask you this. If this is Saudi Arabia's change in stance, how does this address the issue that they have with Iran gaining more control in or dominance in the region with their proxy wars?
So I think that the Saudis will go back to the drawing table, and I think Iran might go to the drawing table as well, because the problem in Yemen is very convoluted, and the fact that there's been so many international kinds of violations, including human rights violations and different other kinds of breaches of international law, both parties have to go back, or are going to go back to the drawing table and think about what it is they really want to achieve in Yemen. Yemen's war didn't start in 2014. Yemen's civil war has been going on for decades, and this is a legacy war. It's a tribal society. Iran is not native to this area. They don't have their own native population that is completely loyal to Tehran or Qom. So they have to kind of sell their Islamic revolution to the people there to carry that flag on forward with them. Whereas the Saudis, they have familiar relations with tribes in Yemen, and they have the proximity to Yemen to their advantage. So I think both parties are going to go back to the drawing table, come up with a new strategy, but this will continue to be an issue for them that drives their policy in the region. It's not like they're going to ignore each other and run away from the battle. I think that they will go back to the drawing table, though, and draw up new strategies to continue the fight, whether it be in Yemen or whether it be on a different front. As Talha said, the Iranians and the Saudis are engaged in proxy conflicts around the region, stretching all the way from Lebanon to Yemen. So there's plenty of space in the geopolitical context for Iran and Yemen to basically, stretch their arms and legs and show off their muscles, if you will. But that will require them to go back and to kind of recover from this defeat. I think both Iran and Saudi have suffered from the results in Yemen, so they will both have to kind of go back and recuperate and come back to the field with a new strategy. This is probably the discussion that they're having in Riyadh and Tehran.
Right, Mr. Talha, let me ask you this then. Like, Iran has faced sanctions upon sanctions from the US, is looking at an economy that is really struggling. And on the other hand, the Trump administration refuses to stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia, who is the key coalition member, bombing thousands of civilians, bombing roads and bridges that are the key routes to Sana'a and other areas in Yemen where humanitarian aid is badly needed. So how does this turn out in Saudi Arabia's against Saudi Arabia? Because they're really, when you speak of international pressure coming on Saudi Arabia, it doesn't come in terms of sanctions on arms sales.
Well, actually, several European countries have decided to stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia. But more to the point, I think we need to qualify certain facts on the ground. So yes, Saudi Arabia is responsible for several severe incidents of civilian damage and death. On the flip side, though, we also do have the Houthis. So I think we have to be a bit more, cautious about how we frame this. The Houthis, let's not forget the siege of Taiz, for example. The humanitarian crisis caused by the Houthis there. The bombing of civilian neighborhoods. This is common tactic amongst the Houthis. As for cutting off roads and supply lines to cities, that is the way that war goes. You can't leave an enemy city being constantly resupplied.
Iranians have done more or less than each other. Both are equally responsible for various crimes in Yemen.
So they're both responsible for severe crimes against humanity, both sides. And we have to keep that in mind. It's not fair to just say the Saudis are responsible for this, and this. In terms of how they're losing, it's also in terms of their international image, which is very important to the Saudi Arabians. I mean, prior to the administration and the reign of King Salman bin Abdul Aziz, they were very cautious about getting involved in international affairs. So even during the Iraq war, they were very cautious about how they approached it diplomatically, and they actually even advised the Americans not to invade. That's quite important, although they allowed them, obviously, to use their land and territory. They didn't actually want it to go ahead. This time, they've taken a more assertive stance, and it's blown up in their faces. And it's cost them billions of dollars. So it doesn't matter if America continues to supply them with weapons. It's also the application of those weapons. What results are they getting you on the ground? So far, the only results that we're seeing are minor gains here and there and a catastrophic and unjustifiable civilian death toll. So that, added to the Khashoggi case and added to all manner of other anti-Saudi movements around the world, has created such an international pressure that I think even countries such as Germany have decided that they would no longer supply Saudi Arabia with weapons due to what happened in Yemen. And that is key and critical because Germany is the most, economically powerful country in Europe.
Right.
Not to be underestimated.
Talha, just hold that thought very quickly. Ms. Beda, last question from you. The UAE and the Saudi Arabia, they're the biggest donors of the humanitarian aid pledge that UN floated out for the help of the Yemenis also. The Saudi-led coalition blockage, however, is preventing a lot of that aid to get through. Why aren't they letting through imports for food, fuel and drugs come through that easily? I mean, yes, there was news coming out that 17 vessels were given permits, but there seems to be a lot of delay in the process.
Yeah, I think this is a twofold kind of issue. There's the issue of the optics. The Saudis, because they're contributing to kind of the destitute situation inside Yemen, they feel like they need to make up for it along with the Emiratis. So they do provide this money. This is something that they do so that they can balance out the negative impact of their actions on the country. On the flip side, the Houthis, they definitely would not want to allow Saudi or Emirati provided aid into Yemen, because then the people who are going to receive that aid are going to praise Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis, and the Houthis don't want that. The Houthis continue to struggle to manage the local population. They have several major cities in Yemen under siege. So for them, if the Saudis and the Emiratis are able to successfully deliver, even through a third party, supposedly objective party like the UN, all the way to those besieged cities, the people receiving the aid will still know that the Saudis and the Emiratis paid for it. And the Houthis do not want to let people have that kind of sentiment towards those two countries.
All right, thank you so much, Obeda, for being with us here on Newsfire. Now, Talha, I want to continue having this conversation with you about these reports that are coming out about the goods that are rejected after long inspection procedures by the Saudis. I mean, can you give us an idea of what the ground reality really is? What is the Yemeni government's role in trying to get humanitarian aid to those who need it the most as soon as possible?
Well, again, I think actually Obeda covered that point very well, is that several of these regions and cities that are under siege by the Houthis would not want any supplies that are funded by the Saudi Arabians and the Emiratis to reach those people who are in need, purely for political reasons. So, they've literally said, to hell with humanitarian concerns right now. We need to be concerned about who is going to receive praise for helping these people. And if it's not us, it's not going to be the Saudis or the Emiratis. That is obviously a very callous way of looking at things. But again, we are in a state of war here. That's what we're looking at. It's literally a war. Sieges are common. They are some of the most devastating tools and methods of war. So you always find that the people that suffer the most are the civilians as opposed to the fighting parties themselves. As to why they're not getting in fully, again, there could be a number of issues. So that's what they're trying to address now in these talks. And that's why it was tabled that the UN may administer the Hodeidah port, simply because 90% of products going into Yemen come through that port. And if that can be distributed amongst the populace, then all the better. However, we need both sides to see the merits of ending the suffering of the civilian population and of trying to come to terms so that both sides are happy. Saudi Arabia should not feel that its southern borders are threatened or that it's about to be encircled by Iranian proxies. Equally, the other side has a right to participation in the political process.
But there's also a concern. There's also a concern by Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that the port of Hodeidah is also the main entry point for weapons for the Houthis, right? Isn't that also posing a problem in stopping aid from getting to those who need it the most?
Yeah, exactly, because several times Iranian-sponsored vessels have been stopped and caught in the port of Hodeidah or in the Gulf of Aden trying to smuggle weapons to the Houthis. So these are legitimate military concerns. Although you may want to improve the optics of your military operations by having humanitarian aid reach people in need, at the same time, you have to weigh that against the military advantages and disadvantages. So, for example, if the Iranians are allowed to smuggle weapons to the Houthis...
Okay, so we're running out of time here, Talha, and I really want to understand what the positive conclusion one could imagine out of this region. You're talking about Saudi Arabia under a lot of international pressure and criticism, trying to take the back foot here, trying to withdraw as a participant of this conflict. So if that leaves the Houthis dealing with the Yemeni government, what kind of obstacles are they facing, and where do you see them heading in terms of power sharing and resolving the issue once and for all?
Well, this goes back to what happened after the Arab Spring. So you have to look at the former dictator and how he was toppled. Not only was he toppled, and there was a broad range participation in government, but the Houthis actually made an alliance with him, and that's what triggered kind of the current civil war. Now, what they have to do is to come to an agreement again, because previously, as Abeda mentioned, there was a civil war decades ago. There was a North and South Yemen. So it has been done before where the North and the South were reunited, and it can be done again. But it all depends on the parties' willingness to sit down and share power or decentralize power so that each region is governed under its own rules, but there's a federal government that oversees the general administration of the country.
Okay, thank you so much, Talha, for your participation here on Newswire. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. We'll be seeing you again next week. Till then, goodbye.